Hi, Vindhya. Great to see you. Could we maybe start by asking you about where you researched and ask you to tell us something about your experiences there?
Sure. I did my research in northern Sri Lanka, specifically in the Jaffna Peninsula, as well as Mullaitivu and Kilinochchi in just south of the peninsula, because they were very central to the Sri Lankan Civil War, which is what I was interested in, and specifically the use of photography in relation to sort of, citizen expressions of political grievances in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Is there a single image that sums up some aspect of your field research?
There is indeed. So this is an image that I took at a commemoration event at Mullaivaikkal in Mullaitivu, which was one of the hardest districts in terms of the end of the Civil War, the final months of the Civil War. The Sri Lankan sort of conflict ended by way of an outright military victory in 2009, where the government forces won over the Tamil militancy. And this came at sort of very great cost to civilian lives. And commemoration remains very contested because of the sort of very conflicting narratives of the war. And every May 18th, the Tamil community has sort of attempted to gather to commemorate the deaths at Mullaivaikkal, even though the state has prohibited it to various extents, including this year, which was, a few days ago. So this image, for example, we see a sort of mourning family gathered around this photoshopped memorial portrait of someone who died. And we see these sort of media workers and activists gathered around this family to sort of capture the moment, as it were. And I think this sums up the different layers of photography that I looked at in relation to sort of the political mobilization of photography in the Sri Lankan post-war, and the different sort of like kinds of photography as well, because this is not also just in relation to media workers and photojournalists who are trying to sort of amplify this narrative of families seeking, justice and accountability in the post-war, but also issues of surveillance where you have state intelligence sort of personnel who are also recording these acts of protest and commemoration as a form of intimidation. So I think this image kind of sums up the different types of photography, the different people involved, and how it speaks to the political uses of photography in post-war Sri Lanka.
Yeah, well, that touches on my next question, which is very much about the general hypothesis that we were working with in the project that suggested that photography gives access to a form of citizenship in advance of ordinary politics. I mean, could you say a bit more about what your view of this is now that you've completed the research?
Sure. So this image was taken at the Tamil Families of the Disappeared protests in Kilinochchi. And this was sort of the beginning of my interest in sort of looking at how photography was used in this post-war space, because it was the most visible use of photography in terms of both political articulation as well as claim making. And I think this is really interesting because what photography was principally used for was to sort of confront the failures of traditional political representation, where communities were being marginalized, by the state or being overlooked by the state, as well as them not feeling adequately represented in terms of, whatever sort of traditional means of representation or politics that were available to them. So it became very much a way in which they made visible, particularly state violence as well as the state's failures in relation to the Civil War. So this specific set of protests took place in response to the state's sort of denial of enforced disappearances that it was responsible for, particularly those that happened towards the end of the war and in its immediate aftermath. So photography then became a tool for amplifying visibility of political grievances, as it were.
So I had a question about the analog and the digital and the disappearance of the analog. But I mean, presumably many of these images are endless digital reproductions of analog originals. And maybe in that context, you could also say something about the diaspora and the role of social media platforms in that.
Sure. So, I mean, it's really interesting because I think these final years of the war between sort of 2005 and 2009 also marked a transition in terms of a move from analog to digital photography. And this obviously impacted the types of photography that were produced out of war in various ways. So we have these kinds of, identity card photographs, studio photographs, which are very sort of traditional types of photography, but also these really awful atrocity images and trophy images that were generated at the front lines by soldiers as well as Tamil militants in response to the sort of carnage that was going on. And I think what's interesting here is the ways in which some of the sort of types and sort of aesthetics of analog photography and how they have persisted through the digital and how they've been replicated by the digital with the almost sort of unified aim of amplifying visibility. So it has a lot to do with, the types of saturation of colors and things like that, which are all geared towards, emphasizing um, losses, as it were, particularly where war death is being dealt with or being addressed. So this has been interesting because also conflict results in mass sort of displacement, dispersal, and Sri Lanka has sort of very large Tamil diaspora that has come out of this context of conflict, and this has also expanded then the circuits of circulation for these images that don't simply situate them within northern Sri Lanka, but also London and Toronto and Paris and Zurich, etc., where diaspora communities have gathered in order to sort of draw attention to the ongoing violences as well as the sort of violences of the final years of the war.
Great, thank you very much, Vindhya.